Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Chapters Live. As always, I am Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, I have on my fabulous hat, my fabulous wizard's hat, in case you noticed. And that is because we are deep in the midst of the excitement and chivalry of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Now, when we picked up last time, 2 weeks ago, we were introduced to our main character, Hank Morgan, who is, let's say at the time, a modern day factory worker, mechanic, jack of all trades, who finds himself in a fight and with one punch is inexplicably knocked back 1,300 years in time to the time of knights and damsels and King Arthur and Merlin. And of course, does not know how he got there and decides to very well make the best of it. Almost immediately, he is imprisoned and placed in great peril. In fact, he's ordered to be executed and manages to save his own life by remembering that an eclipse is scheduled to take place on the day that he is supposed to be executed. So he manages to convince everyone that he is, in fact, a wizard and threatens to blot out the sun if they will not spare his life. Well, of course, the eclipse happens, and he manages to secure his spot. Later on, he manages to convince everyone that he is indeed still a wizard by contriving to manufacture gunpowder and blow up his rival Merlin's tower with an explosion. So, at that point, his spot is secure, and he sort of lives in this weird hodgepodge where he's feared and respected, but he's not necessarily a part of anything because he's not a lord, he's not a serf, he doesn't really belong anywhere. And he's sort of this character out of time that is trying to make, again, the very best of an inexplicable situation. So we're going to, once again, pick up with our book, and we're going to start back up with Chapter 10, Beginnings of Civilization. The Round Table soon heard of the challenge, and of course it was a good deal discussed, for such things interested the boys. The king thought I ought now to set forth in quest of adventure, so that I might gain renown and be the more worthy to meet Sir Sagramore when the several years should have rolled away. I excused myself for the present. I said it would take me 3 or 4 years yet to get things well fixed up and going smoothly. Then I should be ready. All the chances were that at the end of that time, Sir Sagramore would still be out grailing, so no valuable time would be lost by the postponement. I should then have been in office 6 or 7 years, and I believed my system and machinery would be so well developed that I could take a holiday without its working any harm. I was pretty well satisfied with what I had already accomplished. In various quiet nooks and corners, I had the beginnings of all sorts of industries underway, nuclei of future vast factories, the iron and steel missionaries of my future civilization. In these were gathered together the brightest young minds I could find, and I kept agents out raking the country for more all the time. I was training a crowd of ignorant folks into experts in every sort of handiwork and scientific calling. These nurseries of mine went smoothly and privately along undisturbed in their obscure country retreats, for nobody was allowed to come into their precinct without a special permit, for I was afraid of the church. I had started a teacher factory and a lot of Sunday schools the first thing. As a result, I now had an admirable system of graded schools in full blast in these places, and also a complete variety of Protestant congregations, all in a prosperous and growing condition. Everybody could be any kind of a Christian he wanted to. There was perfect freedom in that matter. But I confined public religious teaching to the churches and the Sunday schools, permitting nothing of it in my other educational buildings. I could have given my own sect the preference and made everybody a Presbyterian without any trouble, but that would have been to affront a law of human nature. Spiritual wants and instincts are as various in the human family as our physical appetites, complexions, and features, and a man is only at his best, morally, when he is equipped with the religious garment whose color and shape and size most likely accommodate themselves to the spiritual complexion, angularities, and stature of the individual who wears it. And besides, I was afraid of a united church. It makes a mighty power, the mightiest conceivable. And then when it by and by gets into selfish hands, as it is always bound to want to do, it means death to human liberty and paralysis to human thought. All mines were royal property, and there were a good many of them. They had formerly been worked as savages always work mined, holes grubbed in the earth, and the mineral brought up in sacks of hide by hand, at the rate of a ton a day. But I had begun to put the mining on a scientific basis as early as I could. Yes, I had made pretty handsome progress when Sir Sagramor's challenge struck me. 4 years rolled by, and then, well, you would never imagine it in the world. Unlimited power is the ideal thing when it is in safe hands. An earthly despotism, the despotism of heaven, is the one absolutely perfect government. An earthly despotism would be the absolutely perfect earthly government if the conditions were the same, namely, the despot, the perfectest individual of the human race, and his lease of life perpetual. But as a perishable perfect man must die, and leave his despotism in the hands of an imperfect successor, an earthly despotism is not merely a bad form of government, it is the worst form that is possible. My work showed what a despot could do with the resources of a kingdom at his command. Unsuspected by this dark land, I had the civilization of the 19th century booming under its very nose. It was fenced away from the public view, but there it was, a gigantic and unassailable fact, and to be heard from yet, if I live and had any luck. There it was, as sure a fact, and as substantial a fact as any serene volcano, standing innocent with its smokeless summit in the blue sky, and giving no sign of the rising hell in its bowels. My schools and churches were children 4 years before. They were grown up now. My shops of that day were vast factories now. Where I had a dozen trained men then, I had 1,000 now. Where I had one brilliant expert then, I had 50 now. I stood with my hand on the cock, so to speak, ready to turn it on and flood the midnight world with light at any moment. But I was not going to do the thing in that sudden way. It was not my policy. The people should not have stood it, and moreover, I should have had the established Roman Catholic Church on my back in a minute. No, I had been going cautiously all the while. I had had confidential agents trickling through the country some time, whose office was to undermine knighthood by imperceptible degrees, and to gnaw a little at this and that and the other superstition, and so prepare the way gradually for a better order of things. I was turning on my light one candle power at a time, and meant to continue to do so. I had scattered some branch schools secretly about the kingdom, and they were doing very well. I meant to work this racket more and more as time went on, if nothing occurred to frighten me. One of my deepest secrets was my West Point, my military academy. I kept that most jealously out of sight, and I did the same with my naval academy, which I had established at a remote seaport. Both were prospering to my satisfaction. Clarence was 22 now, and was my head executive, my right hand. He was a darling. He was equal to anything. There wasn't anything he couldn't turn his hand to. Of late, I had been training him for journalism, for the time seemed about right for a start in the newspaper line. Nothing big, but just a small weekly for experimental circulation in my civilization nurseries. He took to it like a duck. There was an editor concealed in him, sure. Already he had doubled himself in one way. He talked 6th century and wrote 19th. His journalistic style was climbing steadily. It was already up to the back settlement Alabama mark, and couldn't be told from the editorial output of that region, either by matter or flavor. We had another large departure on hand, too. This was a telegraph and a telephone, our first venture in this line. These wires were for private service only as yet, and must be kept private until a riper day should come. We had a gang of men on the road, working mainly by night. They were stringing ground wires. We were afraid to put up poles, for they would attract too much inquiry. Ground wires were good enough in both instances, for my wires were protected by an insulation of my own invention, which was perfect. My men had orders to strike across country, avoiding roads, and establishing connection with any considerable towns whose lights betrayed their presence, and leaving experts in charge. Nobody could tell you how to find any place in the kingdom, for nobody ever went intentionally to any place, but only struck it by accident in his wanderings, and then generally left it without thinking to inquire what its name was. At one time and another we had sent out topographical expeditions to survey and map the kingdom, but the priests always interfered and raised trouble. So we had given the thing up for the present. It would be poor wisdom to antagonize the church. As for the general condition of the country, it was as it had been when I arrived in it, to all intents and purposes. I had made changes, but they were necessarily slight, and they were not noticeable. Thus far, I had not even meddled with taxation, outside of the taxes which provided the royal revenues. I had systemized those and put the service on an effective and righteous basis. As a result, those revenues were already quadrupled, and yet the burden was already so much more equitably distributed than before, that all the kingdom felt a sense of relief, and the praises of my administration were hearty and general. Personally, I struck an interruption now, but I did not mind it. It could not have happened at a better time. Earlier it could have annoyed me, but now everything was in good hands and swimming right along. The king had reminded me several times of late that the postponement I had asked for 4 years before had about run out now. It was a hint I ought to be starting out to seek adventures and get up a reputation of a size to make me worthy of the honor of breaking a lance with Sir Sagramore, who was still out grailing, but was being hunted for by various relief expeditions, and might be found any year now. So you see, I was expecting this interruption. It did not take me by surprise. Chapter 11. The Yankee in Search of Adventures. There never was such a country for wandering liars, and they were of both sexes. Hardly a 1 month went by without one of these tramps arriving, and generally loaded with a tale about some princess or other wanting help to get her out of some faraway castle while she was held in captivity by a lawless scoundrel, usually a giant. Now you would think that the first thing the king would do after listening to such a novelette from an entire stranger would be to ask for credentials, yes, and a pointer or two as to locality of castle, best route to it, and so on. But nobody ever thought of so simple and common sense a thing as that. No, everybody swallowed these people's lies whole and never asked a question of any sort about anything. Well, one day when I was not around, one of these people came along. It was a she one this time, and told a tale of the usual pattern. Her mistress was a captive in the vast and gloomy castle, along with 44 other young and beautiful girls, pretty much all of them princesses. They'd been languishing in that cruel captivity for 26 years. The masters of the castle were 3 stupendous brothers, each with 4 arms and 1 eye, the eye in the center of their forehead, and as big as a fruit. Sort of fruit, not stated, their usual slovenliness and statistics. Would you believe it? The king and the whole round table were in raptures over this preposterous opportunity for adventure. Every knight of the table jumped for the chance and begged for it, but to their vexation and chagrin the king conferred it upon me, who had not asked for it at all. By an effort I contained my joy when Clarence brought me the news. But he could not contain his. His mouth gushed delight and gratitude in a steady discharge, delight in my good fortune, gratitude to the king for this splendid mark of his favor for me. He could keep neither his legs nor his body still, but pirouetted about the place in an airy ecstasy of happiness. On my side, could have cursed the kindness that conferred upon me this benefaction, but I kept my vexation under the surface for policy's sake, and did what I could to let on to be glad. Indeed, I said I was glad. And in a way it was true. I was as glad as a person is when he is disemboweled. Well, one must make the best of things, and not waste time with useless fretting, but get down to business and see what can be done. In all lives there is wheat among the chaff. I must get at the wheat in this case, so I sent for the girl, and she came. She was a comely enough creature, and soft and modest, but if signs went for anything, she didn't know as much as a lady's watch. I said, "My dear, have you been questioned as to particulars?" She said she hadn't. "Well, I didn't expect that you had, but I thought I would ask to make sure it's the way I've been raised. Now, you mustn't take it unkindly if I remind you that as we don't know you, we must go a little slow. You may be all right, of course, and we'll hope that you are, but to take it for granted isn't business. You understand that. I'm obliged to ask you a few questions. Just answer up fair and square, and don't be afraid. Where do you live when you are at home?" "In the land of Modor, fair sir." "Land of Modor. Don't remember hearing of it before. Parents living?" "As to that I know not, yet if they be yet alive, sith it is many years that I have lain shut up in the castle." "Your name, please." "I hide the demoiselle Alessandre la Carlois, as it please you." "Do you know anybody here that can identify you?" "That were not likely, fair lord. I being come hither now for the first time." "Have you brought any letters, any documents, any proofs that you are trustworthy and truthful?" "Of a surety, no, and wherefore should I? Have I not a tongue, and I say all that myself?" But you're saying it, and somebody else is saying it is different. Different? How might that be? I fear I do not understand. Don't understand. Land of... Well, you see, great Scott, can't you understand a little thing like that? Can't you understand the difference between your... Why do you look so innocent and idiotic? I? In truth, I know not. But an it were the will of God. Yes, I reckon that's about the size of it. Don't mind my seeming excited. I'm not. Let us change the subject. Now, as to this castle with 45 princesses in it and 3 ogres at the head of it, tell me, where is this harem? Harem? The castle, you understand. Where's the castle? Oh, as to that, it is great and strong and well beseen, and lieth in a far country. Yes, it is many leagues. How many? Ah, fair sir, it were woundly hard to tell. There are so many, and so do lap the one upon the other, and being made all in the same image, and tinctured with the same colour, one may not know the one league from its fellow, nor how to count them, except they be taken apart. And ye wit well it were God's work to do that, being not within man's capacity, for ye will not... Hold on, never mind about the distance. Whereabouts does the castle lie? What's the direction from here? Ah, please you, sir, it hath no direction from here, by reason that the road lieth not straight, but turneth evermore. Wherefore the direction of its place abideth not, but is sometime under the one sky, and anon under another. Whereso, if ye be minded that it is in the east, and went thitherward, ye shall observe that the way of the road doth again turn upon itself by the space of half a circle. And this marvel happening again, and yet again, and still again, it will grieve you that you have thought by vanities of the mind to thwart, and bring to naught the will of him that giveth not a castle a direction from a place, except it pleaseth him. And if it please him not, will the rather that even all castles in all directions thereunto vanish out of the earth, leaving the places wherein they tarry desolate and vacant, so warning his creatures that where he will, and where he will not, he... Oh, that's all right, give us a rest, never mind about the direction, hang the direction. I beg pardon. I beg 1,000 pardons. I am not well today. Pay no attention when I soliloquize. It is an old habit, an old bad habit, and hard to get rid of when one's digestion is all disordered with eating food that was raised forever and ever before he was born. Good land. Man can't keep his functions regular on spring chickens 1,300 years old. But come, never mind about that. Have you got such a thing as a map of that reason about you? Now, a good map. Is it peradventure that manner of thing which of late the unbelievers have brought from over the great seas, which, being boiled in oil and an onion and salt added thereto, doth... What? A map? What are you talking about? Don't you know what a map is? There, never mind. Don't explain. I hate explanations. They fog a thing up so you can't tell anything about it. Run along, dear. Good day. Show her the way, Clarence. Oh, well, it was reasonably plain now why these donkeys didn't prospect these liars for details. It may be that this girl had a fact in her somewhere, but I don't believe you could have sluiced it out with a hydraulic, nor got it with the earlier forms of blasting. Even, it was a case for dynamite. Why, she was a perfect ass. Yet the king and his knights had listened to her as if she'd been a leaf out of the gospel. It kind of sizes up the whole party. And think of the simple ways of this court. This wandering wench hadn't any more trouble to get access to the king and his palace than she would have had to get into the poorhouse in my day and country. In fact, he was glad to see her, glad to hear her tale. With that adventure of hers to offer, she was as welcome as a corpse is to a coroner. Just as I was ending up these reflections, Clarence came back. I remarked upon the barren result of my efforts with the girl, hadn't got hold of a single point that could help me to find the castle. The youth looked a little surprised, or puzzled, or something, and intimated that he had been wondering to himself what I had wanted to ask the girl all those questions for. Why, great guns, I said, don't I want to find the castle? And how else would I go about it? La, sweet your worship, one may lightly answer that, I ween. She will go with thee, they always do, she will ride with thee. Ride with me? Nonsense. But of a truth she will ride with thee, thou shalt see. What? She browse around the hills and scour the woods with me, alone, and I as good as engaged to be married. Why, scandalous. Think how it would look. My, the dear face that rose before me. The boy was eager to know all about this tender matter. I swore him to secrecy and then whispered her name. Puss Flanagan. He looked disappointed and said he didn't remember the Countess. How natural it was for the little courtier to give her a rank. He asked me where she lived. In East Hart. I came to myself and stopped, a little confused. Then I said, Never mind. Now, I'll tell you someday. And might he see her? Would I let him see her someday? It was but a little thing to promise, 1,300 years or so, and he was so eager, so I said yes. But I sighed. I couldn't help it. And yet there was no sense in sighing, for she wasn't born yet. But that is the way we are made. We don't reason. Where we feel, we just feel. My expedition was all the talk that day and that night, and the boys were very good to me and made much of me and seemed to have forgotten their vexation and disappointment and come to be as anxious for me to hive those ogres and set those ripe old virgin loose as if it were themselves that had the contract. Well, they were good children, but just children, that is all. And they gave me no end of points about how to scout for giants and how to scoop them in. And they told me all sorts of charms against enchantments, and gave me salves and other rubbish to put on my wounds. But it never occurred to one of them to reflect that if I was such a wonderful necromancer as I was pretending to be, I had not to need salves or instructions or charms against enchantments, and least of all arms and armor on a foray of any kind, even against fire-spouting dragons and devils hot from perdition, let alone such poor adversaries as these I was after, these commonplace ogres of the back settlements. I was to have an early breakfast and start at dawn, for that was the usual way, but I had the demon's own time with my armor, and this delayed me a little. It was troublesome to get into, and there is so much to tell. First you wrap a layer or two of blanket around your body for a sort of cushion and to keep off the cold iron. Then you put on your sleeves and shirt of chainmail. These are made of small steel links woven together, and they form a fabric so flexible that if you toss your shirt onto the floor, it slumps into a pile like a peck of wet fishnet. It is very heavy, and is nearly the uncomfortablest material in the world for a nightshirt, yet plenty used it for that. Tax collectors and reformers and one-horse kings with a defective title and those sorts of people. And then you put on your shoes, flatboats roofed over with interleaving bands of steel, and screw your clumsy spurs into the heels. Next you buckle your greaves to your legs and your cusses on your thighs. Then come your back plate and your breastplate, and you begin to feel crowded. Then you hitch on to the breastplate the half petticoat of broad overlapping bands of steel, which hangs down in front but was scalloped out behind so you can sit down, and isn't any real improvement on an inverted coal scuttle, either for looks or for wear, or to wipe your hands on. Next you belt on your sword, and then you put your stovepipe joints on to your arms, your iron gauntlets on to your hands, your iron rat trap onto your head, with a rag of steel web hitched onto it to hang over the back of your neck, and there you are, snug as a candle in a candle mold. This is no time to dance. Well, a man that is packed away like that is a nut that isn't worth the cracking. There is so little of the meat, when you get down to it, by comparison with the shell. The boys helped me, or I could never have got in. Just as we finished, Sir Belvedere happened in, and I saw that as like as not I hadn't chosen the most convenient outfit for a long trip. How stately he looked, and tall and broad and grand. He had on his head a conical steel casque that only came down to his ears, and for visor had only a narrow steel bar that extended down to his upper lip and protected his nose, and all the rest of him from neck to heel was flexible chainmail, trousers and all. But pretty much all of him was hidden under his outside garment, which was, of course, of chainmail, as I said, and hung straight from his shoulders to his ankles, and from his middle to the bottom, both before and behind, was divided, so that he could ride and let the skirts hang down on either side. He was going grailing, and it was just the outfit for it, too. I would have given a good deal for that ulster, but it was too late now to be fooling around. The sun was just up, the king and the court were all on hand to see me off and wish me luck, so it wouldn't be etiquette for me to tarry. You don't get on your horse yourself. No, if you tried it, you would get disappointed. They carry you out just as they carry a sunstruck man to the drugstore and put you on and help you get to rights and fix your feet in the stirrups, and all the while you do feel so strange and stuffy and like somebody else, like somebody that has been married on a sudden or struck by lightning or something like that, and hasn't quite fetched around yet and is sort of numb and can't just get his bearings. Then they stood up the mask they called a spear in its socket by my left foot, and I gripped it with my hand. Lastly, they hung my shield around my neck, and I was all complete and ready as up anchor and to get to sea. Everybody was as good to me as they could be, and a maid of honor gave me the stirrup cup her own self. There was nothing more to do now but for that damsel to get up behind me on a pillion, which she did, and put an arm or so around to hold on. And so we started, and everybody gave us a good-bye and waved their handkerchiefs or helmets. And everybody we met going down the hill and through the village was respectful to us, except some shabby little boys in the outskirts. They said, "Oh, what a guy!" and hove clods at us. In my experience, boys are the same in all ages. They don't respect anything. They don't care for anything or anybody. They say, "Go up, bald head," to the prophet going his unoffending way in the gray of antiquity. They sass me in the holy gloom of the Middle Ages. And I'd seen them act the same way in Buchanan's administration. I remember because I was there and helped. The prophet had his bears and settled with his boys, and I wanted to get down and settle with mine, but it wouldn't answer because I couldn't have got up again. I hate a country without a derrick. Chapter 12, Slow Torture. Straight off, we were in the country. It was most lovely and pleasant in these sylvan solitudes, in the early cool morning, in the first freshness of autumn. From hilltops, we saw fair green valleys lying spread out below, with streams winding through them, and island groves of trees here and there, and huge lonely oaks scattered about, and casting black blots of shade. And beyond the valleys, we saw the range of hills, blue with haze, stretching away in billowy perspective to the horizon, with at wide intervals a dim fleck of white or gray on a wave summit, which we knew was a castle. We crossed broad natural lawns sparkling with dew, and we moved like spirits, the cushioned turf giving out no sound of footfall. We dreamed along through glades in a mist of green light that got its tint from the sun-drenched roof of leaves overhead. And by our feet the clearest and coldest of runlets went frisking and gossiping over its reefs and making a sort of whispering music comfortable to hear. And at times we left the world behind and entered into the solemn great deeps and rich gloom of the forest, where furtive wild things whisked and scurried by, and were gone before you could even get your eye on the place where the noise was, and where only the earliest birds were turning out and getting to business with a song here and a quarrel yonder and a mysterious far-off hammering and drumming for worms on a tree trunk, away somewhere in the impenetrable remoteness of the woods. And by out we would swing again into the glare. About the third or fourth or fifth time that we swung out into the glare, it was along there somewhere, a couple of hours or so after sunup. It wasn't as pleasant as it had been before. It was beginning to get hot. This was quite noticeable. We had a long pool after that, without any shade. Now, it is curious how progressively little frets grow and multiply once they get a start. Things which I didn't mind at all at first, I began to mind now, and more too, all the time. The first 10 or 15 times I wanted my handkerchief, I didn't seem to care. I got along and said, "Never mind, it isn't any matter," and dropped it out of my mind. But now it was different. I wanted it all the time. It was nag, 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 right or wrong, and no rest. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and so at last I lost my temper and said, "Hang a man that would make a suit of armor without any pockets in it." You see, I had my handkerchief in my helmet, and some things, but it was that kind of a helmet that you can't take off by yourself. That hadn't occurred to me when I put it there, and in fact, I didn't know it. I supposed it would be particularly convenient there. And so now the thought of it being there, so handy and close by, and yet not gettable, made it all the worse and the harder to bear. Yes, the thing that you can't get at is the thing that you want, mainly. Everyone has noticed that. Well, it took my mind off from everything else, took it clear off, and centered it in my helmet, and mile after mile, there it stayed, imagining the handkerchief, picturing the handkerchief, and it was bitter and aggravating to have the salt sweat keep trickling down into my eyes, and I couldn't get at it. It seems like a little thing on paper, but it was not a little thing at all. It was the most real kind of misery. I would not say it if it was not so. I made up my mind that I would carry along a reticule next time, let it look how it might, and people say what they would. Of course, these iron dudes of the round table would think it was scandalous, and maybe raise shoal about it, but as for me, give me comfort first, and style afterwards. So we jogged along, and now and then we struck a stretch of dust, and it would tumble up in clouds and get into my nose and make me sneeze and cry. And of course, I said things I oughtn't to have said. I don't deny that. I'm not better than others. We couldn't seem to meet anybody in this lonesome Britain, not even an ogre. In the mood I was in then, it was well for the ogre, that is, an ogre with a handkerchief. Most knights would have thought of nothing but getting his armor, but so I got his bandana, he could keep his hardware for all me. Meantime, it was getting hotter and hotter in there. You see, the sun was beating down and warming up the iron more and more all the time. Well, when you are hot, that way every little thing irritates you. When I trotted, I rattled like a crate of dishes, and that annoyed me, and moreover, I couldn't seem to stand that shield slatting and banging, now about my breast, now about my back. And if I dropped into a walk, my joints creaked and screeched in that wearisome way that a wheelbarrow does. And as we didn't create any breeze at that gate, I was like to get fried in that stove. And besides, the quieter you went, the heavier the iron settled down on you, and the more and more tons you seemed to weigh every minute. And you had to be always changing hands and passing your spear over to the other foot. It got so irksome for one hand to hold it long at a time. Well, you know, when you perspire that way, in rivers, there comes a time when you itch. You are inside, your hands are outside, so there you are, nothing but iron between. It's not a light thing, let it sound as it may. First it is one place, and then another, and then some more, and it goes on spreading, and at last the territory is all occupied, and nobody can imagine what you feel like, nor how unpleasant it is. And when it had got to the worst, and it seemed to me that I could not stand anything more, a fly got in through the bars and settled on my nose, and the bars were stuck and wouldn't work, and I couldn't get the visor up, and I could only shake my head, which was baking hot by this time, and the fly, well, you know how a fly acts when he has got a certainty. He only minded the shaking enough to change from nose to lip, and lip to ear, and buzz, buzz, and all around in there, and keep on lighting and biting, in a way that a person already so distressed as I was simply could not stand. So I gave in and got Alessandre to unship the helmet and relieve me of it. Then she emptied the conveniences out of it and fetched it full of water, and I drank, and then stood up, and she poured the rest of it down inside the armor. One cannot think how refreshing it was. She continued to fetch and pour until I was well soaked and thoroughly comfortable. It was good to have a rest and peace, but nothing is quite perfect in this life at any time. I had made a pipe a while back, and also some pretty fair tobacco. Not the real thing, but what some of the Indians use, the inside bark of the willow dried. These comforts had been in the helmet, and now I had them again, but no matches. Gradually, as the time wore along, one annoying fact was borne in upon my understanding, that we were weather-bound. An armed novice cannot mount his horse without help, and plenty of it. Sandy was not enough for me anyway. We had to wait until somebody should come along. Waiting in silence would have been agreeable enough, for I was full of matter for reflection and wanted to give it a chance to work. I wanted to try and think out how it was that rational or even half-rational men could have ever learned to wear armor, considering its inconveniences, and how they managed to keep up such a fashion for generations when it was plain that what I had suffered today they'd had to suffer all the days of their lives. I wanted to think that out. And moreover, I wanted to think out some way to reform this evil and persuade the people to let the foolish fashion die out. But thinking was out of the question in the circumstances. You couldn't think where Sandy was. She was a quite biddable creature and good-hearted, but she had a flow of talk that was as steady as a mill, and made your head sore like the drays and wagons in a city. If she had had a cork, she would have been a comfort, but you can't cork that kind, they'll die. Her clack was going all day, and you would think that something would surely happen to her works by and by. But no, they never got out of order, and she never had to slack up for words. She could grind and pump and churn and buzz by the week, and never stopped to oil up or blow out. And yet the result was just nothing but wind. She never had any ideas, any more than a fog has. She was a perfect blatherskite. I mean, for jaw, talk, jabber, but just as good as she could be. I hadn't minded her mill that morning on account of having that hornet's nest of other troubles. But more than once in the afternoon I had to say, "Take a rest, child. The way you're using up all the domestic air, the kingdom will have to go on importing it by tomorrow, and it's a low enough treasury without that." Chapter 13. Freeman. Yes, it is strange how little a while at a time a person can be contented. Only a little while back, when I was rioting and suffering, what a heaven this peace, this rest, this sweet serenity seemed, where I could keep perfectly comfortable all the time in this secluded, shady nook by this purling stream would have seemed, where I could keep perfectly comfortable all the time by pouring a dipper of water into my armor now and then. Yet already I was getting dissatisfied, partly because I could not light my pipe, for although I had long ago started a match factory, I had forgotten to bring matches with me, and partly because we had nothing to eat. Here was another illustration of the childlike improvidence of this age and people. A man in armor always trusted to chance for his food on a journey, and would have been scandalized at the idea of hanging a basket of sandwiches at his spear. There was probably not a knight of all the Round Table combination who would not rather have died than been caught carrying such a thing as that on his flagstaff. And yet there could not be anything more sensible. It had been my intention to smuggle a couple of sandwiches into my helmet, but I was interrupted in the act and had to make an excuse and lay them aside, and a dog got them. Night approached, and with it a storm. The darkness came on fast. We must camp, of course. I found a good shelter for the demoiselle under a rock, and went off and found another for myself. But I was obliged to remain in my armor, because I could not get it off by myself, and yet could not allow Alessandre to help, because it would have seemed so like undressing before folk. It would not have amounted to that in reality, because I had clothes on underneath, but the prejudices of one's breeding are not got rid of at just at a jump, and I knew that when it came to stripping off that bob-tailed iron petticoat, I should be embarrassed. With the storm came a change of weather, and the stronger the wind blew and the wilder the rain lashed about, the colder and colder it got. Pretty soon, various kinds of bugs and ants and worms and things began to flock in out of the wet and crawl down inside my armor to get warm. And while some of them behaved well enough and snuggled up against my clothes and got quiet, the majority were of a restless, uncomfortable sort, and never stayed still but went on prowling and hunting for that they did not know what, especially the ants, which went tickling along in wearisome procession from one end of me to the other by the hour, and are a kind of creatures which I never wish to sleep with again. It would be my advice to persons situated in this way not to roll and thrash about, because this excites the interest of all the different sorts of animals and makes every last one of them want to turn about out and see what is going on. And this makes things worse than they were before, and of course makes you objurgate harder too if you can. Still, if one did not roll and thrash around, he would die. So perhaps it is as well to do one way as the other. There is no real choice. Even after I was frozen solid, I could still distinguish that tickling, just as a corpse does when he is taking electric treatment. I said I would never wear armor after this trip. All those trying hours whilst I was frozen and yet was in a living fire, as you may say, on account of that swarm of crawlers, that same unanswerable question kept circling and circling through my tired head. How do people stand this miserable armor? How have they managed to stand it all these generations? How can they sleep at night for dreading the tortures of next day? When the morning came at last, I was in a bad enough plight, seedy, drowsy, fagged from want of sleep, weary from thrashing around, famished from long fasting, pining for a bath and how to get rid of the animals, and crippled with rheumatism. And how had it fared with the nobly born, the titled aristocrat, the demoiselle Alessandre La Cartois? Why, she was as fresh as a squirrel. She had slept like the dead, and as for a bath, probably neither she nor any other noble in the land had ever had one, and so she was not missing it. Measured by modern standards, they were merely modified savages, those people. This noble lady showed no impatience to get breakfast, and that smacks of the savage too. On their journeys, those Britons were used to long fasts, and knew how to bear them, and also how to freight up against probable fasts before starting, after the style of the Indian and the anaconda. As like as not, Sandy was loaded for a 3-day stretch. We were off before sunrise, Sandy riding and I limping along behind. In half an hour we came upon a group of ragged poor creatures who had assembled to mend the thing which was regarded as a road. They were as humble as animals to me, and when I proposed to breakfast with them, they were so flattered, so overwhelmed by this extraordinary condescension of mine, that at first they were not able to believe that I was in earnest. My lady put up her scornful lip and withdrew to one side. She said in their hearing that she would as soon think of eating with the other cattle. a remark which embarrassed these poor devils merely because it referred to them, and not because it insulted or offended them, for it didn't. And yet they were not slaves, not chattels. By a sarcasm of law and phrase, they were freemen. 7/10 of the free population of the country were of just their class and degree, small, independent, farmers, artisans, etc., which is to say they were the nation, the actual nation. They were about all of it that was useful, or worth saving, or really respect-worthy, and to subtract them would have been to subtract the nation and leave behind some dregs, some refuge in the shape of a king, nobility and gentry, idle, unproductive, acquainted mainly with the arts of wasting and destroying, and of no sort of use or value in any rationally constructed world. And yet, by ingenious contrivance, this gilded minority, instead of being in the tail of the procession where it belonged, was marching head up and banners flying at the other end of it, had elected itself to be the nation, and these innumerable clams had permitted it so long that they had come at last to accept it as a truth, and not only that, to believe it right and as it should be. The priests had told their fathers and themselves that this ironical state of things was ordained by God, and so, not reflecting on how unlike God it would be to amuse himself with sarcasms, and especially such poor transparent ones as this, they had dropped the matter there and become respectfully quiet. The talk of these meek people had a strange enough sound in a formerly American ear. They were freemen, but they could not leave the estates of their lord or their bishop without his permission. They could not prepare their own bread, but must have their corn ground and their bread baked at his mill and his bakery, and pay roundly for the same. They could not sell a piece of their own property without paying him a handsome percentage of the proceeds, nor buy a piece of somebody else's without remembering him in cash for the privilege. They had to harvest his grain for him gratis and be ready to come at a moment's notice, leaving their own crop to destruction by the threatened storm. They had to let him plant fruit trees in their fields and then keep their indignation to themselves when his heedless fruit gatherers trampled the grain around the trees. They had to smother their anger when his hunting parties galloped through their fields, laying waste the result of their patient toil. They were not allowed to keep doves themselves, and when the swarms from my lord's dovecotes settled on their crops, they must not lose their temper and kill a bird, for awful would the penalty be. When the harvest was at last gathered, then came the procession of robbers to levy their blackmail upon it. First the church carted off its fat 10th, then the king's commissioner took his 20th, then my lord's people made a mighty inroad upon the remainder, after which the skinned freeman had liberty to bestow the remnant in his barn, in case it was worth the trouble. There were taxes, and taxes, and taxes, and more taxes, and taxes again, and yet other taxes upon this free and independent pauper, but none upon his lord, the baron, or the bishop, none upon the wasteful nobility or the all-devouring church. If the baron would sleep unvexed, the freeman must sit up all night after his day's work and whip the ponds to keep the frogs quiet. If the freeman's daughter, but no, that last infamy of monarchical government is unprintable. And finally, if the freeman, grown desperate with his tortures, found his life unendurable under such conditions and sacrificed it and fled to death for mercy and refuge, the gentle church condemned him to eternal fire. The gentle law buried him at midnight at the crossroads with a stake through his back, and his master, the baron or the bishop, confiscated all his property and turned his widow and his orphans out of doors. And here were these freemen assembled in the early morning to work on their lord the bishop's road 3 days each, gratis, every head of a family and every son of a family, 3 days each, gratis, and a day or so added for their servants. Why, it was like reading about France and the French before the ever memorable and blessed Revolution, which swept 1,000 years of such villainy away in one swift tidal wave of blood. One, a settlement of that hoary debt in the proportion of half a drop of blood for each hogshead of it that had been pressed by slow tortures out of that people in the weary stretch of 10 centuries of wrong and shame and misery, the like of which was not to be mated but in hell. There were 2 reigns of terror, if we would but remember it and consider it. The one wrought murder in hot passion, the other in heartless cold blood. The one lasted mere months, the other had lasted 1,000 years. The one inflicted death upon 10,000 persons, the other upon 100 millions. But our shudders are all for the horrors of the minor terror, the momentary terror, so to speak. Whereas, what is the horror of swift death by the axe compared with lifelong death from hunger, cold, insult, cruelty, and heartbreak? What is swift death by lightning compared with death by slow fire at the stake? A city cemetery could contain the coffins filled by that brief terror which we have all been so diligently taught to shiver at and mourn over, but all France could hardly contain the coffins filled by that older and real terror, that unspeakably bitter and awful terror which none of us has been taught to see in its vastness or pity as it deserves. These poor ostensible freemen who were sharing their breakfast and their talk with me were as full of humble reverence for their king and church and nobility as their worst enemy could desire. There was something pitifully ludicrous about it. I asked them if they supposed a nation of people ever existed who, with a free vote in every man's hand, would elect that a single family and its descendants should reign over it forever, whether gifted or boobies, to the exclusion of all other families, including the voters, and would also elect that a certain 100 families should be raised to dizzy summits of rank, and clothed on with offensive transmissible glories and privileges, to the exclusion of the rest of the nation's families, including his own. They all looked unhit and said they didn't know, that they had never thought about it before, and it hadn't occurred to them that a nation could be so situated that every man could have a say in the government. I said I had seen one, and that it would last until it had an established church. Again, they were all unhit, first. But presently one man looked up and asked me to state that proposition again, and state it slowly, so it could soak in his understanding. I did it, and after a little he had the idea, and he brought his fist down and said he didn't believe a nation where every man had a vote would voluntarily get down in the mud and dirt in any such way, and that to steal from a nation its will and preference must be a crime, and the first of all crimes. I said to myself, this one's a man. If I were backed by enough of his sort, I would make strike for the welfare of this country and try to prove myself its loyalist citizen by making a wholesome change in its system of government. You see, my kind of loyalty was loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions or its office holders. The country is the real thing, the substantial thing, the eternal thing. It is the thing to watch over and care for and be loyal to. Institutions are extraneous. They are its mere clothing, and clothing can wear out, become ragged, cease to be comfortable, cease to protect the body from winter, disease, and death. To be loyal to rags, to shout for rags, to worship rags, to die for rags, that is a loyalty of unreason. It is pure animal. It belongs to monarchy. Was invented by monarchy. Let monarchy keep it. I was from Connecticut, where a constitution declares that all political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit, and that they have at all times an undeniable and indefeasible right to alter their form of government in such a manner as they may think expedient. Under that gospel, the citizen who thinks that he sees that the Commonwealth's political clothes are worn out, and yet holds its peace and does not agitate for a new suit, is disloyal. He is a traitor. That he may be the only one who thinks he sees this decay does not excuse him. It is his duty to agitate anyway, and it is the duty of the others to vote him down if they do not see the matter as he does. And now here I was, in a country where the right to say how the country should be governed was restricted to 6 persons in each 1,000 of its populace. For the 994 to express dissatisfaction with the regnant system and propose to change it would have made the whole 6 shudder as one man. It would have been so disloyal, so dishonorable, such putrid black treason. So to speak, I was become a stockholder in a corporation where 994 of the members furnished all the money and did all the work, and the other 6 elected themselves a permanent board of direction and took all the dividends. It seemed to me that what the 994 dupes needed was a new deal. The thing that would have best suited the circus side of my nature would have been to resign the bossship and get up an insurrection and turn it into a revolution. But I knew that the Jack Cade or the Wat Tyler who tries such a thing without first educating his materials up to revolution grade is almost absolutely certain to get left. I'd never been accustomed to getting left, even when I do say it myself. Wherefore the deal, which had been for some time working into shape in my mind, was of a quite different pattern from the Cade-Tyler sort. So I did not talk blood and insurrection to that man there who sat munching black bread with that abused and mistaught herd of human sheep, but took him aside and talked matter of another sort to him. After I'd finished, I got him to lend me a little ink from his veins, and with this and a sliver I wrote on a piece of bark, "Put him in the man factory," and gave it to him and said, Take it to the palace at Camelot, and give it into the hands of Améas le Poulet, whom I call Clarence, and he will understand." "He is a priest, then," said the man, and some of the enthusiasm went out of his face. "What? A priest? Didn't I tell you that no chattel of the church, no bond slave of pope or bishop can enter my man factory? Didn't I tell you that you couldn't enter unless your religion, whatever it might be, was your own free property? Marry, it is so, and for that I was glad, wherefore it liked me not, and bred me a cold doubt to hear of this priest being there. But he isn't a priest, I tell you." The man looked far from satisfied. He said, "He is not a priest, and yet he can read?" "He is not a priest, and yet can read. Yes, and write, too, for that matter. I taught him myself." The man's face cleared. "And it is the first thing that you yourself will be taught in that factory." "Aye, I would give blood out of my heart to know that art. Why, I will be your slave. No, you won't. You won't be anybody's slave. Take your family and go along. Your lord the bishop will confiscate your small property, but no matter, Clarence will fix you all right." Chapter 14. Defend Thee, Lord. I paid 3 pennies for my breakfast, and a most extravagant price it was, too, seeing that one could have breakfasted a dozen persons for that money. But I was feeling good by this time, and I had always been a kind of spindrift anyway. And then these people had wanted to give me the food for nothing, scant as their provision was. And so it was a grateful pleasure to emphasize my appreciation and sincere thankfulness with a good big financial lift, where the money would do so much more good than it would in my helmet, where, these pennies being made of iron and not stinted in weight, my $half worth was a good deal of a burden to me. I spent money rather too freely in those days, it is true, but one reason for it was that I hadn't got the proportions of things entirely adjusted, even yet, after so long a sojourn in Britain. Hadn't got along to where I was able to absolutely realize that a penny in Arthur's Land and a couple of dollars in Connecticut were about one and the same thing. Just twins, you might say, in purchasing power. If my start from Camelot could have been delayed a very few days, I could have paid these people in beautiful new coins from our own mint, and that would have pleased me, and them, too, not less. I had adopted the American values exclusively. In a week or two now, cents, nickels, dimes, quarters, and $half, and also a trifle of gold, would be trickling in thin but steady streams all through the commercial veins of the kingdom, and I looked to see this new blood freshen up its life. The farmers were bound to throw in something to sort of offset my liberality, whether I would or no, so I let them give me a flint and steel, and as soon as they had comfortably bestowed Sandy and me on our horse, I lit my pipe. When the first blast of smoke shot out through the bars of my helmet, all those people broke for the woods, and Sandy went over backwards and struck the ground with a dull thud. They thought I was one of those fire-belching dragons they had heard so much about from knights and other professional liars. I had infinite trouble to persuade these people to venture back within explaining distance. Then I told them that this was only a bit of enchantment which would work harm to none but my enemies. And I promised, with my hand on my heart, that if all who felt no enmity toward me would come forward and pass before me, they should see that only those who remained behind would be struck dead. The procession moved with a good deal of promptness. There were no casualties to report, for nobody had curiosity enough to remain behind to see what would happen. I lost some time now for these big children, their fears gone, became so ravished with wonder over my awe-compelling fireworks that I had to stay there and smoke a couple of pipes out before they would let me go. Still, the delay was not wholly unproductive, for it took all that time to get Sandy thoroughly wonted to the new thing, she being so close to it, you know. It plugged up her conversation mill, too, for a considerable while, and that was a gain. But above all other benefits accruing, I had learned something. I was ready for any giant or any ogre that might come along now. We tarried with a holy hermit that night, and my opportunity came about the middle of the next afternoon. We were crossing a vast meadow by way of shortcut, and I was musing absently, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, and Sandy suddenly interrupted a remark which he had begun that morning with the cry, "Defend thee, Lord, peril of life is toward!" And she slipped down from the horse and ran a little way and stood. I looked up and saw, far off in the shade of a tree, 6 armed knights and their squires, and straightway there was bustle among them, and tightening of saddle girths for the mount. My pipe was ready and would have been lit, if I had not been lost in thinking about how to banish oppression from this land and restore to all its people their stolen rights and manhood without disobliging anybody. I lit up at once, and by the time I had got a good head of reserve steam on, here they came. All together, too, none of these chivalrous magnanities which one reads so much about, one courtly rascal at a time, and the rest standing by to see fair play. No, they came in a body. They came with a whir and a rush. They came like a volley from a battery, came with heads low down, plumes streaming out behind, lances advanced at a level. It was a handsome sight, a beautiful sight, for a man up a tree. I laid my lance in rest and waited, with my heart beating, till the iron wave was just ready to break over me, then spouted a column of white smoke through the bars of my helmet. You should have seen the wave go to pieces and scatter. This was a finer sight than the other one. But these people stopped, 200 or 300 yards away, and this troubled me. My satisfaction collapsed, and fear came. I judged I was a lost man. But Sandy was radiant and was going to be eloquent, but I stopped her and told her my magic had miscarried somehow or other, and she must mount with all dispatch, and we must ride for life. No, she wouldn't. She said that my enchantment had disabled those knights. They were not riding on because they couldn't. Wait, they would drop out of their saddles presently, and we would get their horses in harness. I could not deceive such trusting simplicity, so I said it was a mistake, that when my fireworks killed at all, they killed instantly. No, the men would not die. There was something wrong about my apparatus. I couldn't tell what, but we must hurry and get away, for those people would attack us again in a minute. Sandy laughed and said, "Lack-a-day, sir, they be not of that breed. Sir Lancelot will give battle to dragons, and will abide by them, and will assail them again, and still again, till he do conquer and destroy them. And so likewise was Sir Pellinore, and Sir Aglavale, and Sir Carados, and mayhap others, but there be none else that will venture it. Let the idle say what the idle will. And la, as to yonder base rufflers, think ye they have not had their fill, but yet desire more? Well then, what are they waiting for? Why don't they leave? Nobody's hindering. Good land, I'm willing to let bygones be bygones, I'm sure. Leave, is it? Oh, give thyself easement as to that. They dream not of it. No, not they. They wait to yield them. Come. Really, is that sooth, as you people say? If they want to, why don't they? You would like them much, but an ye want how dragons are esteemed, ye would not hold them blamable. They fear to come. Well then, suppose I go to them, and, you wit ye well, they would not abide your coming. I will go. And she did. She was a handy person to have along on a raid. I would have considered this a doubtful errand myself. I presently saw the knights riding away and Sandy coming back. That was a relief. I judged she had somehow failed to get the first innings. I mean in conversation, otherwise the interview wouldn't have been so short. But it turned out that she had managed the business well, in fact admirably. She said that when she told those people I was the boss, it hit them where they lived. Smote them sore with fear and dread, was her word. And that then they were ready to put up with anything she might require. So she swore them to appear at Arthur's court within 2 days and yield them, with horse and harness, and be my knights henceforth, and subject to my commands. How much better she managed that thing than I should have done it myself. She was a daisy. Chapter 15, Sandy's Tale. And so I'm proprietor of some knights, said I as we rode off. Who would have ever supposed that I should live up to list assets of that sort? I shan't know what to do with them unless I raffle them off. How many of them are there, Sandy? 7, please you, sir, and their squires. Well, it's a good haul. Who are they? Where do they hang out? Where do they hang out? Yes, where do they live? I understood thee not. Then I will tell ye as soons. Then she said musingly and softly, turning the words daintily over her tongue, hang they out. Where do they hang out? Right so, where do they hang out? Of a truth, the phrase hath a fair and winsome grace, and is prettily worded withal. I will repeat it anon and anon in my idleness, whereby I may peradventure learn it. Where do they hang out? Even so, I already it falleth trippingly from my tongue, and for as much as, don't forget the cowboys, Sandy. Cowboys? Yes, the knights, you know. You were going to tell me about them a while back, you remember. Figuratively speaking, games called. Game? Yes. Go to the bat. Get to work on your statistics, and don't burn so much kindling getting your fire started. Tell me about the knights. I will well, and lightly will begin. So they two departed and rode into a great forest, and Great Scott! You see, I recognized my mistake at once. I had opened up her sluices. It was my own fault. She'd be 30 days getting down to those facts. And she generally began with a preface and finished without a result. If you interrupted her, she would either go right back along without noticing or answer with a couple of words and go back and say the sentence over again. So interruptions only did harm, and yet I had to interrupt and interrupt pretty frequently too in order to save my life. A person would die if he let her monotony drip on him right along all day. Great Scott! I said in my distress. She went right back and began all over again. So they two departed and rode into a great forest, and which two? Sir Gawain and Sir Uwaine. And so they came to an abbey of monks, and they were well lodged. So on the morn they heard the masses in the abbey, and so they rode forth till they came to a great forest. Then was Sir Gawain ware in a valley of a turret, by a turret of 12 fair damsels, and 2 knights armed on great horses. And the damsels went to and fro by a tree. And then was Sir Gawain where how there hung a white shield on that tree, and ever as the damsels came by it, they spit upon it, and some threw mire upon the shield. Now, if I hadn't seen the like myself in the country, Sandy, I wouldn't believe it. But I've seen it, and I can just see those creatures now parading before the shield and acting like that. The women here certainly do act all like all possessed. Yes, and I mean your best, too, society's very choicest brands. The humblest hello girl along 10,000 miles of wire could teach gentleness, patience, modesty, manners to the highest duchess in Arthur's land. Hello girl? Yes, but don't you ask me to explain. It's a new kind of girl. They don't have them here. One often speaks sharply to them when they are not the least in fault, and he can't get over feeling sorry for it and ashamed of himself in 1,300 years. Such shabby, mean conduct, and so unprovoked. The fact is, no gentleman ever does it, though I myself, if I've got to confess, peradventure she, never mind her, I tell you, I could never explain her, so you would understand. Even so be it, sith ye are so minded. Then Sir Gawain and Sir Uwaine went and saluted them, and asked them why they did that, despite to the shield. Sirs, said the damsels, we shall tell you. There is a knight in this country that owneth this white shield, and he is passing good man of his hands, but he hateth all ladies and gentlewomen, and therefore we do all this despite to the shield. I will say you, said Sir Gawain, it beseemeth evil a good knight to despise all ladies and gentlewomen, and peradventure, though he hate you, he hath some cause, and peradventure he loveth in some other places lady and gentlewomen, and to be loved again, and he is such a man of prowess as you speak of. Man of prowess, yes, that's as the man to please them, Sandy. Man of brains, that is the thing they never think of. Tom Sayers, John Heenan, John L. Sullivan, pity but you could be here. You would have your legs under the round table and a sir in front of your names within the 24 hours. And you could bring about a new distribution of the married princesses and duchesses of the court in another 24. The fact is, it is just a sort of polished-up court of Comanches, and there isn't a squaw in it who doesn't stand ready at the dropping of a hat to desert to the buck with the biggest string of scalps at his belt. And he be such a man of prowess as ye speak of, said Sir Gawain. Now, what is his name? Sir, said they, his name is Marhaus, the king's son of Ireland. Son of the king of Ireland. You mean the other form doesn't mean anything. And look out and hold on tight now. He must jump this gully. There, we're all right now. This horse belongs in the circus. He's born before his time. I know him well, said Sir Uwaine. He is a passing good knight, as any is on live. On live. If you've got a fault in the world, Sandy, it is that you are a shade too archaic, but it isn't any matter. For I saw him once proved at a just that where many knights were gathered, and in that time there might no man withstand him. Ah, said Sir Gawain, damsels, methinketh ye are to blame, for it is to suppose that he that hung that shield there will not be long therefrom, and that maybe those knights match him on horseback, and that is more your worship than thus. For I will abide no longer to see a knight's shield dishonoured. And therewith Sir Gawain and Sir Uwaine departed a little from them. And then were they where Sir Marhaus came riding on a great horse straight toward them. And when the 12 damsels saw Sir Marhaus, they fled into the turret as they were wild, so that some of them fell by the way. Then one of the knights of the tower dressed his shield and said on high, Sir Marhaus, defend thee. And so they ran together, that the knight brake his spear on Marhaus. And Marhaus smote him so hard that he brake his neck and the horse's back. Well, that is just the trouble about these state of things. It ruins so many horses. That saw the other knight of the turret, and dressed him down toward Marhaus, and they went so eagerly together that this knight of the turret was soon smitten down, horse and man stark dead, another horse gone. I tell you, it is a custom that ought to be broken up. I don't see how people with any feeling can applaud and support it. So these two knights came together with great random. I saw that I had been asleep and missed a chapter, but I didn't say anything. I judged that the Irish knight was in trouble with the visitors by this time, and this turned out to be the case. That Sir Uwaine smote Sir Marhaus, that his spear brast in pieces on the shield, and Sir Marhaus smote him so sore that horse and man he bare to the earth, and hurt Sir Uwaine on the left side. The truth is, Alisande, these archaics are a little too simple. The vocabulary is too limited, and so, by consequence, descriptions suffer in the matter of variety. They run too much to level Saharas of fact, and not enough to picturesque detail. This throws about them a certain air of the monotonous. In fact, the fights are all alike. A couple of people come together with great random. Random's a good word, and so is exegesis, for that matter, and so is Holocaust, and defalcation, and usufruct, and 100 others, but land, a body ought to discriminate. They come together with great random, and a spear's brast, and one party break his shield, and the other goes down, horse and man, over his horsetail, and break his neck. And then the next candidate comes randoming in and brast his spear, and the other man brast his shield, and down he goes, horse and man, over his horsetail, and break his neck. And then there's another elected, and another, and still another, till the material is all used up. And when you come to figure up results, you can't tell one fright from another, nor who whipped, and as a picture of living, raging, roaring battle show. Why, it's pale and noiseless, as ghosts shuffling in a fog. Dear me, what would this barren vocabulary get out of the mightiest spectacle? The burning of Rome in Nero's time, for instance. Why, it would merely say, town burned down, no insurance, boy brashed a window, fireman break his neck. Why, that ain't a picture. It was a good deal of a lecture, I thought, but it didn't disturb Sandy, didn't turn a feather. Her steam soared steadily up again the minute I took off the lid. Then Sir Marhaus turned his horse and rode towards Sir Gawaine with his spear. And when Sir Gawaine saw that, he dressed his shield, and they aventured their spears. And they came together with all the might of their horses, that either knight smote other so hard in the midst of their shields. But Sir Gawaine's spear brake. I knew it would. But Sir Marhaus's spear held, and therewith Sir Gawaine and his horse rushed down to the earth, just so, and brake his back. And lightly Sir Gawaine rose upon his feet, and pulled out his sword, and dressed him towards Sir Marhaus on foot. And therewith either came unto other eagerly, and smote together with their swords, that their shields flew in cantils, and they bruised their helms and the hauberks, and wounded either other. But Sir Gawaine, fro it past 9 of the clock, waxed by the space of 3 hours ever stronger and stronger, and thrice his might was increased. All this espied Sir Marhaus, and had great wonder how his might increased. And so they wounded other passing sore, and then when it was come noon, the pelting sing-song that carried me forward to scenes and sounds of my boyhood days. New Haven, 10 minutes for refreshments. Conductor'll strike the gong bell 2 minutes before train leaves. Passengers for the shoreline, please take seats in the rear car. This car don't go no further. Apples, oranges, bananas, sandwiches, popcorn. And waxed past noon and drew toward evensong. Sir Gawaine's strength feebled and waxed passing faint, that unneth he might endure any longer. And Sir Marhaus was then bigger and bigger, which strained his armor, of course, and little would one of these people mind a small thing like that. And so, Sir Knight, said Sir Marhaus, I have well felt that ye are a passing good knight, and a marvellous man of might, as ever I felt any while it lasted. And our quarrels are not great, and therefore it were a pity to do your hurt, for I feel you are passing feeble. Ah, said Sir Gawaine, gentle knight, ye say the word that I should say. And therewith they took off their helms, and either kissed other, and there they swore together either to love other as brethren. But I lost the thread there and dozed off to slumber, thinking about what a pity it was that men with such superb strength enabling them to stand up cased in cruelly burdensome iron and drenched with perspiration, and hack and batter and bang each other for 6 hours on a stretch, should not have been born at a time when they could have put it to some useful purpose. Take a jackass, for instance. A jackass has that kind of strength and puts it to a useful purpose, and is valuable to this world because he is a jackass. But a nobleman is not valuable because he is a jackass. It is a mixture that is always ineffectual, and should never have been attempted in the first place. And yet once you start a mistake, the trouble is done, and you never know what is going to come of it. When I came to myself again and began to listen, I perceived that I had lost another chapter, and that Alissande had wandered a long way off with her people. And so they rode and came into a deep valley full of stones, and thereby they saw a fair stream of water. Above thereby was the head of the stream, a fair fountain, and 3 damsels sitting thereby. In this country, said Sir Marhaus, came never knight since it was christened, but he found strange adventures. This is not good form, Alessandre. Sir Marhaus, the king's son of Ireland, talks like all the rest. You ought to give him a brogue, or at least a characteristic expletive. By this means one would recognize him as soon as he spoke without his ever being named. It's a common literary device with the great authors. You should make him say, in this country, be jabers, come never knight, since it was christened, but he found strange adventures, be jabers. See how much better that sounds. Came never knight, but he found strange adventures, be jabers. Of a truth it doth indeed, fair lord, albeit 'tis passing hard to say, though peradventure that will not tarry, but better speed with usage. And then they rode to the damsels, and either saluted other, and the eldest had a garland of gold about her head, and she was 60 winter of age or more. The damsel was. Even so, dear lord, and her hair was white unto the garland. Celluloid teeth, $9 a set, as like as not, the loose-fit kind that go up and down like a portcullis when you eat, and fall out when you laugh. The second damsel was of 30 winter of age, with a circlet of gold about her head. The third damsel was but of 15 year of age. Billows of thought came rolling over my soul, and the voice faded out of my hearing. 15! Break my heart, oh, my lost darling! Just her age, who was so gentle and lovely, and all the world to me, whom I shall never see again. How the thought of her carries me back over wide seas of memory to a vague, dim time, a happy time, so many centuries hence, when I used to wake in the soft summer mornings out of sweet dreams of her, and say, "Hello, Central," just to hear her dear voice come melting back to me with a "Hello, Hank," that was music of the spears to my enchanted ear. She got $3 a week, but she was worth it. I could not follow Alessandre's further explanation of who our captured knights were now. I mean, in case she should ever get to explaining who they were. My interest was gone, my thoughts were far away and sad. By fitful glimpses of the drifting tale, caught here and there and now and then, I merely noted in a vague way that each of these 3 knights took one of these 3 damsels up behind him on his horse, and one rode north, another east, the other south, to seek adventures, and meet again and lie after a year and a day. A year and a day, and without baggage. It was of a piece with the general simplicity of the country. The sun was now setting. It was about 3 in the afternoon when Alessandre began to tell me who the cowboys were, so she had made pretty good progress with it, for her. She would arrive some time or other, no doubt, but she was not a person who could be hurried. We were approaching a castle which stood on high ground, a huge, strong, venerable structure, whose gray towers and battlements were charmingly draped with ivy, and whose whole majestic mass was drenched with splendors sprung from the sinking sun. It was the largest castle we had seen, and so I thought it might be the one we were after, but Sandy said no. She did not know who owned it. She said she had passed it without calling when she went down to Camelot. Chapter 16. Morgan Le Fay. If knights-errant were to be believed, not all castles were desirable places to seek hospitality in. As a matter of fact, knights-errant were not persons to be believed, that is, measured by modern standards of veracity, yet measured by the standards of their own time, and scaled accordingly, you got the truth. It was very simple. You discounted a statement 97%, the rest was fact. Now, after making this allowance, the truth remained that if I could find out something about a castle before ringing the doorbell, hailing the warders, it was the sensible thing to do. So I was pleased when I saw in the distance a horseman making the bottom turn of the road that wound down from the castle. As we approached each other, I saw that he wore a plumed helmet. It seemed to be otherwise clothed in steel, but wore a curious addition also, a stiff square garment like a herald's tabard. However, I had to smile at my own forgetfulness when I got nearer and read this sign on his tabard: Persimmon soap, all the prime dawn use it. That was a little idea of my own, and had several wholesome purposes in view toward the civilizing and uplifting of this nation. In the first place, it was a furtive, underhand blow at this nonsense of knight-errantry, though nobody suspected that but me. I'd started a number of these people out, the bravest knights I could get, each sandwiched between bulletin boards bearing one device or another, and I judged that by and by, when they got to be numerous enough, they would begin to look ridiculous, and then even the steel-clad ass that hadn't any board would himself begin to look ridiculous because he was out of the fashion. Second, these missionaries would gradually, and without creating suspicion or exciting alarm, introduce a rudimentary cleanliness among the nobility, and from them it would work down to the people if the priests could be kept quiet. This would undermine the church. Would be a step toward that. Next, education, next freedom, and then she would begin to crumble. It being my conviction that any established church is an established crime, an established slave pen, I had no scruples, but was willing to assail it in any way or with any weapon that promised to hurt it. Why, in my own former day, in remote centuries not yet stirring in the womb of time, there were old Englishmen who imagined that they had been born in a free country with the Corporation Act and the test still in force in it, timbers propped up against men's liberties and dishonored consciences to shore up an established anachronism with. My missionaries were taught to spell out the gilt signs on their tabards. The showy gilding was a neat idea. I could have got the king to wear a bulletin board for the sake of that barbaric splendor. They were to spell out these signs and then explain to the lords and ladies what soap was, and if the lords and ladies were afraid of it, get them to try it on a dog. The missionary's next move was to get the family together and try it on himself. It was to stop at no experiment, however desperate, that could convince the nobility that soap was harmless. If any final doubt remained, he must catch a hermit. The woods were full of them. Saints, they called themselves, and saints they were believed to be. They were unspeakably holy and worked miracles, and everybody stood in awe of them. If a hermit could survive a wash, and that can fail to convince a duke, give him up, let him alone. Whenever my missionaries overcame a knight-errant on the road, they washed him, and when he got well, they swore him to go and get a bulletin board and disseminate soap and civilization the rest of his days. As a consequence, the workers in the field were increasing by degrees, and the reform was steadily spreading. My soap factory felt the strain early. At first, I had only 2 hands, but before I left home, I was already employing 15, and running night and day, and the atmospheric result was getting so pronounced that the king went sort of fainting and gasping about, and said he did not believe he could stand it much longer. And Sir Launcelot got so he did hardly anything but walk up and down the roof and swear, though I told him it was worse up there than anywhere else, but he said he wanted plenty of air. He was always complaining that a palace was no place for a soap factory. Anyway, he said if a man was to start one in his house, he would be damned if he wouldn't strangle him. There were ladies present, too, but much these people ever cared for that. They would swear before children if the wind was their way when the factory was going. This missionary knight's name was Le Cote Maletele, and he said that this castle was the abode of Morgan le Fay, sister of King Arthur and wife of King Uriens, monarch of a realm about as big as the District of Columbia. You could stand in the middle of it and throw bricks into the next kingdom. Kings and kingdoms were as thick in Britain as they had been in Little Palestine in Joshua's time, when people had to sleep with their knees pulled up because they couldn't stretch out without a passport. Le Cote was much depressed, for he had scored here the worst failure of his campaign. He had not worked off a cake, yet he had tried all the tricks of his trade, even to the washing of a hermit. But the hermit died. This was indeed a bad failure, for this animal would now be dubbed a martyr, and would take his place among the saints of the Roman calendar. Thus made he his moan, this poor Sir La Cote Maletale, and sorrowed passing sore. And so my heart bled for him, and I was moved to comfort and stay him. Wherefore I said, Forbear to grieve, fair knight, for this is not a defeat. We have brains, you and I, and for as such as have brains there are no defeats, but only victories. Observe how we will turn this seeming disaster into an advertisement for our soap, and the biggest one to draw that was ever thought of. an advertisement that will transform that Mount Washington defeat into a Matterhorn victory. We will put on your bulletin board, patronized by the elect. How does that strike you? Verily, it is wonderly bethought. Well, the body is bound to admit that for just a modest one-line ad, it's a corker. So the poor Compoteur's grace vanished away. He was a brave fellow, and had done mighty feats of arms in his time. His chief celebrity rested upon the events of an excursion like this one of mine, which he had once made with a damsel named Maledicent, which was as handy with her tongue as was Sandy, though in a different way, for her tongue churned forth only railings and insult, whereas Sandy's music was of a kindlier sort. I knew his story well, and so I knew how to interpret the compassion that was in his face when he bade me farewell. He was supposed I was having a bitter hard time of it. Sandy and I discussed his story as we rode along, and she said that Lacote's bad luck had begun with the very beginning of that trip, for the king's fool had overthrown him on the first day, and in such cases it was customary for the girl to desert to the conqueror, but Maledicent didn't do it, and also persisted afterward in sticking to him after all his defeats. But, said I, suppose the victor should decline to accept his spoil. She said that wouldn't answer. He must. He couldn't decline. It wouldn't be regular. I made a note of that. If Sandy's music got to be too burdensome, sometime I would let a knight defeat me, on the chance that she would desert to him. In due time we were challenged by the warders from the castle walls, and after a parley admitted. I have nothing pleasant to tell about that visit, but it was not a disappointment, for I knew Mrs. Lefay by reputation, and was not expecting anything pleasant. She was held in awe by the whole realm, for she had made everybody believe she was a great sorceress. All her ways were wicked, all her instincts devilish. She was loaded to the eyelids with cold malice. All her history was black with crime, and among her crimes murder was common. I was most curious to see her, as curious as I could have been to see Satan. To my surprise, she was beautiful. Black thoughts had failed to make her expression repulsive. Age had failed to wrinkle her satin skin or mar its bloomy freshness. She could have passed for old Urian's granddaughter. She could have mistaken for sister to her own son. As soon as we were fairly within the castle gates, we were ordered into her presence. King Urians was there, a kind-faced old man with a subdued look, and also the son, Sir Uwaine les Blanchemont, in whom I was of course interested on account of the tradition that he had once done battle with 30 knights, and also on account of his trip with Sir Gawain and Sir Marhaus, which Sandy had been aging me with. But Morgan was the chief attraction, the conspicuous personality here. She was head chief of this household, that was plain. She caused us to be seated, and then she began, with all manner of pretty graces and graciousness, to ask me questions. Dear me, it was like a bird or a flute or something talking. I felt persuaded this woman must have been misrepresented, lied about. She trilled along, and presently a handsome young page, clothed like the rainbow, and as easy as undulatory of movement as a wave, came with something on a golden salver, and kneeling to present it to her, overdid his graces and lost his balance, and so fell lightly against her knee. She slipped a dirk into him in as matter of course a way as another person would have harpooned a rat. Poor child, he slumped to the floor, twisted his silken limbs in one great straining contortion of pain, and was dead. Out of the Gold King was wrung an involuntary "Oh!" of compassion. The look he got made him cut it suddenly short and not put any more hyphens in it. Sir Uwaine, at a sign from his mother, went to the anteroom and called some servants, and meanwhile Madame went rippling sweetly along with her talk. I saw she was a good housekeeper, for while she talked she kept a corner of her eye on the servants to see that they made no balks in handling the body and getting it out. When they came with clean, fresh towels, she sent back for the other kind, and when they had finished wiping the floor and were going, she indicated a crimson fleck the size of a tear which their duller eyes had overlooked. It was plain to me that Lacote Maletale had failed to see the mistress of the house. Often, how louder and clearer than any tongue does dumb circumstantial evidence speak. Morgan Le Fay rippled along as musically as ever. Marvelous woman! And what a glance she had! When it fell in reproof upon those servants, they shrank and quailed as timid people do when the lightning flashes out of a cloud. I could have got the habit myself. It was the same with that poor old Brer Urians. He was always on the ragged edge of apprehension. She could not even turn toward him, but he winced. In the midst of the talk, I let drop a complimentary word about King Arthur, forgetting for the moment how this woman hated her brother. That one little compliment was enough. She clouded up like a storm. She called for her guards and said, "Hile thee these varlets to the dungeon." It struck cold in my ears, for her dungeons had a reputation. Nothing occurred to me to say or do, but not so with Sandy. As the guard laid a hand upon me, she piped up with the tranquillest confidence and said, "God's wounds, dost thou covet destruction, thou maniac? It is the boss." Now, what a happy idea that was, and so simple, yet it never would have occurred to me. I was born modest, not all over, but in spots, and this was one of the spots. The effect upon Madame was electrical. It cleared her countenance and brought back her smiles and all her persuasive graces and blandishments. But nevertheless, she was not able to entirely cover up with them the fact that she was in a ghastly fright. She said, "La, but do list to mine handmaid, as if one gifted with powers like to mine might say the thing which I have said unto one who has vanquished Merlin, and be not jesting. By mine own enchantments I foresaw your coming, and by them I knew you when you entered here. I did but play this little jest with hope to surprise you into some display of your art, as not doubting you would blast the guards with occult fires, consuming them to ashes on the spot, a marvel much beyond mine own ability, yet one which I have long been childishly curious to see." The guards were less curious, and got out as soon as they got permission. Chapter 17, and our last for the night, a royal banquet. Madame, seeing me pacific and unresentful, no doubt judged that I was deceived by her excuse, for her fright dissolved away, and she was soon so inopportune to have me give an exhibition and kill somebody that the thing grew to be embarrassing. However, to my relief, she was presently interrupted by the call to prayers. I will say this much for the nobility, that tyrannical, murderous, rapacious, and morally rotten as they were deeply and enthusiastically religious. Nothing could divert them from the regular and faithful performance of the pieties enjoined by the Church. More than once I had seen a noble who had gotten his enemy at a disadvantage stop to pray before cutting his throat. More than once I had seen a noble, after ambushing and dispatching his enemy, retire to the nearest wayside shrine and humbly give thanks, without even waiting to rob the body. There was to be nothing finer or sweeter in the life of even Benvenuto Cellini, that rough-hewn saint 10 centuries later. All the nobles of Britain with their families attended divine service morning and night daily in their private chapels, and even the worst of them had family worship 5 or 6 times a day besides. The credit of this belonged entirely to the Church. Although I was no friend of that Catholic Church, I was obliged to admit this, and often, in spite of me, I found myself saying, "What would this country be without the Church?" After prayers, we had dinner in a great banqueting hall which was lighted by hundreds of grease jets, and everything was as fine and lavish and rudely splendid as one might become the royal degree of the hosts. At the head of the hall on a dais was the table of the king, queen, and their son, Prince Yuan. Stretching down the hall from this was the general table on the floor. At this, above the salt, sat the visiting nobles and the grown members of their families of both sexes. The resident court, in effect, 61 persons. Below the salt sat minor officers of the household with their principal subordinates, altogether 118 persons sitting, and about as many liveried servants standing behind their chairs, or serving in one capacity or another. It was a very fine show. In a gallery, a band with cymbals, horns, harps, and other horrors opened the proceedings with what seemed to be the crude first draft or original agony of the wail known to later centuries as "In the Sweet By and By." It was new and ought to have been rehearsed a little more. For some reason or other, the Queen had the composer hanged after dinner. After this music, the priest who stood behind the royal table said a great, noble long grace in ostensible Latin. Then the battalion of waiters broke away from their posts and darted, rushed, flew, fetched, and carried, and the mighty feeding began, no words anywhere, but absorbing attention to business. The rows of chops opened and shut in vast unison, and the sound of it was like to the muffled burr of subterranean machinery. The havoc continued an hour and a half, and unimaginable was the destruction of substantials. Of the chief feature of the feast, the huge wild boar that lay stretched out so portly and imposing at the start, nothing was left but the semblance of a hoop skirt, and he was but the type and symbol of what had happened to all the other dishes. With the pastries and so on, the heavy drinking began, and the talk. Gallon after gallon of wine and mead disappeared, and everybody got comfortable, then happy, then sparklingly joyous, both sexes, and by the by pretty noisy. Men told anecdotes that were terrific to hear, but nobody blushed. When the nub was sprung, the assemblage let go with a horse laugh that shook the fortress. Ladies answered back with historiettes that would have almost made Queen Margaret of Navarre or even the great Elizabeth of England hide behind a handkerchief. But nobody hid here, but only laughed, howled, you might say. In pretty much all these dreadful stories, ecclesiastics were the hearty heroes, but that didn't worry the chaplain any. He had his laugh with the rest. More than that, upon invitation, he roared out a song which was of as daring a sort as any that was sung that night. By midnight, everybody was fagged out and sore with laughing, and as a rule, drunk, some weepingly, some affectionately, some hilariously, some quarrelsomely, some dead and under the table. Of the ladies, the worst spectacle was a lovely young duchess, whose wedding eve this was, and indeed she was a spectacle, sure enough. Just as she was, she could have sat in advance for the portrait of the young daughter of the regnant d'Orleans, at the famous dinner when she was carried, foul-mouthed, intoxicated, and helpless, to her bed, in the lost and lamented days of the ancient regime. Suddenly, even while the priest was lifting his hands and all conscious heads were bowed in reverent expectation of the coming blessing, there appeared under the arch of the far-off door at the bottom of the hall an old and bent and white-haired lady, leaning upon a crutch-stick, and she lifted the stick and pointed it toward the queen and cried out, "The wrath and curse of God fall upon you, woman without pity, who have slain mine innocent grandchild and made desolate this old heart that had not chick, nor friend, nor stay, nor comfort in all this world but him." Everybody crossed himself in a grisly fright, for a curse was an awful thing to these people. But the queen rose up majestic with the death light in her eye and flung back this ruthless command, "Lay hands on her, to the stake with her." The guards left their posts to obey. It was a shame. It was a cruel thing to see. What could be done? Sandy gave me a look. I knew she had another inspiration. I said, "Do what you choose." She was up and facing toward the queen in a moment. She indicated me and said, "Madam, he saith this may not be. Recall the commandment, or he will dissolve the castle, and it shall vanish away like the unstable fabric of a dream." Confound it, what a crazy contract to pledge a person to. What if the queen? But my consternation subsided there, and my panic passed off, for the queen, all in a collapse, made no show of resistance, but gave a countermanding sign and sank into her seat. When she reached it, she was sober. So were many of the others. The assemblage rose, whiffed ceremony to the winds, and rushed for the door like a mob, overturning chairs, smashing crockery, tugging, struggling, shouldering, crowding, anything to get out before I should change my mind and puff the castle into the measureless dim vacancies of space. Well, they were a superstitious lot. It is all a body can do to conceive of it. The poor queen was so scared and humbled that she was even afraid to hang the composer without first consulting me. I was very sorry for her. Indeed, anyone would have been, for she was really suffering, so I was willing to do anything that was reasonable, and had no desire to carry things to wanton extremities. I therefore considered the matter thoroughly, and extended by having the musicians ordered into our presence to play that sweet By and By again, which they did. Then I saw that she was right, and gave her permissions to hang the whole band. This little relaxation of sternness had a good effect upon the queen. A statesman gains little by the arbitrary exercise of ironclad authority upon all occasions that offer, for this wounds the just pride of his subordinates, and thus tends to undermine his strength. A little concession, now and then, where it can do no harm, is the wiser policy. Now that the queen was at ease in her mind once more, and measurably happy, her wine naturally began to assert itself again, and it got a little the start of her. It set her music going, her silver bell of a tongue. Dear me, she was a master talker. It would not become me to suggest that it was pretty late and that I was a tired man and very sleepy. I wished I had gone off to bed when I had the chance. Now I must stick it out. There was no other way. So she tinkled along and along in the otherwise profound and ghostly hush of the sleeping castle, until by the by there came, as if from deep down under us, a faraway sound, as of a muffled shriek, with an expression of agony about it that made my flesh crawl. The queen stopped, and her eyes lighted in pleasure. She tilted her graceful head as a bird does when it listened. The sound bored its way up through the stillness again. What is it? I said. It is truly a stubborn soul, and endureth long. It is many hours now. Endureth what? The rack. Come, you shall see a blithe sight. And he yield not his secret now, ye shall see him torn asunder. What a silky smooth hellion she was, and so composed and serene, when the cords all down my legs were hurting in sympathy with that man's pain. Conducted by mailed guards bearing flaring torches, we tramped along echoing corridors, and down stone stairways dank and dripping, and smelling of mold and ages of imprisoned night. A chill, uncanny journey, and a long one, and not made the shorter nor the cheerier by the sorceress's talk, which was about the sufferer and his crime. He had been accused by an anonymous informer of having killed a stag in the royal preserves. I said, Anonymous testimony isn't just the right thing, Your Highness. It were fairer to confront the accused with the accuser. I had not thought of that, it being but of small consequence, and I would not, for that the accuser came masked by night, and told the forester, and straightway got him hence again, and so the forester knoweth him not. Then is this unknown the only person who saw the stag killed? Marry, no man saw the killing, but this unknown saw this hardy wretch near to the spot where the stag lay, and came with right loyal zeal and betrayed him to the forester. So the unknown was near the dead stag too? Isn't it just possible he did the killing himself? His loyal zeal in a mask looks just a shade suspicious. But what is your highness's idea for racking the prisoner? He will not confess else, and then were his soul lost. For his crime his life is forfeited by the law, and of a surety will I see that he payeth it. But it were peril to my own soul to let him die unconfessed and unabsolved. Nay, I were a fool to fling me into hell for his accommodation. But, your highness, suppose he has nothing to confess. As to that we shall see anon, and I rack him to death, and he confess not, it will peradventure show that he had indeed not to confess. You will grant that that is sooth. Then shall I not be damned for an unconfessed man that had not to confess. Therefore I shall be safe. It was the stubborn unreasoning of the time. It was useless to argue with her. Arguments have no chance against petrified training. They wear it as little as the waves wear a cliff. And her training was everybody's. The brightest intellect in the land would not have been able to see that her position was defective. As we entered the rack cell, I caught a picture that will not go from me. I wish it would. A native young giant of 30 or thereabouts lay stretched upon the frame on his back, with his wrists and ankles tied to ropes which led over windlasses at either end. There was no color in him. His features were contorted and set, and sweat drops stood upon his forehead. A priest bent over him on each side. The executioner stood by. Guards were on duty. Smoking torches stood in sockets along the walls. In a corner crouched a poor young creature, her face drawn and anguished, a little wild, half-wild and haunted look in her eyes, and in her lap lay a little child asleep. Just as we stepped across the threshold, the executioner gave his machine a slight turn, which wrung a cry from both the prisoner and the woman. But I shouted, and the executioner released the strain without waiting to see who spoke. I would not let this horror go on. It would have killed me to see it. I asked the queen to let me clear the place and speak to the prisoner privately. And when she was going to object, I spoke in a low voice and said I did not want to make a scene before her servants, but I must have my way, for I was King Arthur's representative and was speaking in his name. She saw she had to yield. I asked her to endorse me to these people and then leave me. It was not pleasant for her, but she took the pill and even went further than I was meaning to require. I only wanted the backing of her own authority, but she said, Ye will do in all things as his lord shall command. It is the boss. It was certainly a good word to conjure with. You could see it by the squirming of these rats. The queen's guards fell into line, and she and they marched away with their torch bearers and woke the echoes of the cavernous tunnels with the measured beat of their retreating footfalls. I had the prisoner taken from the rack and placed upon his bed, and medicaments applied to his hurts and wine given him to drink. The woman crept near and looked on, eagerly, lovingly, but timorously, like one who fears a repulse. Indeed, she tried to furtively touch the man's forehead and jumped back, the picture of fright, when I turned unconsciously toward her. It was pitiful to see. Lord, I said, stroke him, lass, if you want to. Do anything you've a mind to. Don't mind me. Why, her eyes were as grateful as an animal's when you do it a kindness that it understands. The baby was out of her way, and she had her cheek against the man's in a minute, and her hands fondling his hair and her happy tears running down. The man revived and caressed his wife with his eyes, which was all he could do. I judged I might clear the den now, and I did, cleared it of all but the family and myself. Then I said, "Now, my friend, tell me your side of this matter. I know the other side." The man moved his head in sign of refusal, but the woman looked pleased, as it seemed to me, pleased with my suggestion. I went on. "You know me." "Yes, all do in Arthur's realms. If my reputation has come to you right and straight, you should not be afraid to speak." The woman broke in eagerly. "Ah, fair my lord, do thou persuade him. Thou canst and thou will. Ah, he suffered so, and it is for me, for me. And how can I bear it? I would I might see him die, a sweet, swift death. Oh, my Hugo, I cannot bear this one." And she fell to sobbing and groveling about my feet and still imploring. Imploring what? The man's death? I could not quite get the bearings of the thing, but Hugo interrupted her and said, "Peace! You wit not what she asks. Shall I starve whom I love to win a gentle death? Or when thou knowest me better?" "Well," I said, "I can't quite make this one out. It is a puzzle. Now, ah, dear my lord, and ye will but persuade him. Consider how these his tortures wound me. Oh, and he will not speak. Whereas the healing, the solace that lie in a blessed swift death. What are you meandering about? He's going out from here a free man and whole. He's not going to die." The man's white face lit up, and the woman flung herself at me in a most surprising explosion of joy and cried out, "He is saved! For it is the king's word by the mouth of the king's servant, Arthur, the king whose word is gold." "Well, then, you do believe I can be trusted after all? Why didn't you before?" "Who doubted? Not I, indeed, and not she." "Well, why wouldn't you tell me your story then?" "Ye had made no promise, else it had been otherwise." I see, and yet I believe I don't quite see after all. You stood the torture and refused to confess, which shows plain enough to even the dullest understanding that you had nothing to confess. "I, my lord, how so? It was I that killed the deer." "You did? Oh dear, this is the most mixed up business that ever. Dear lord, I begged him on my knees to confess, but you did? It gets thicker and thicker. What did you want him to do it for?" "Said it would bring him a quick death and save him all this cruel pain." "Well, yes, there's reason in that. But he didn't want the quick death." "He? Why, of a surety he did." "Well, then why in the world didn't he confess?" "Oh, sweet sir, and leave my wife and chick without bread and shelter?" "Oh, heart of gold, now I see it. The bitter law takes the convicted man's estate and beggars his widow and his orphans. They could torture you to death, but without conviction or confession, they could not rub your wife and baby. You stood by them like a man, and you, true wife and true woman that you are, you would have brought him release from torture at cost to yourself of slow starvation and death. Well, it humbles a body to think what your sex can do when it comes to self-sacrifice. I'll book you both for my colony. You'll like it there. It's a factory where I'm going to turn groping and grubbing automata into men." And that is where I shall leave you this week in our reading of Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. I hope you deeply enjoyed tonight's reading, and I hope you will tune in 2 weeks' time. That will be in the month of May. It will be Thursday, May 12th at 7 p.m. right here on YouTube, just like always, and we will dive back into this wonderful, delightful book. Until then, keep reading, keep wearing your fabulous wizard's hats. I hope everyone's wearing a fabulous wizard's hat. Tell me all about the fabulous wizard's hats you're all wearing. Keep watching all of our past episodes. Go back and watch all of our animated ones, all the ones that we've been reading over. I believe this is our 8th or 9th book that we've read from beginning to end since starting chapters. Go back and watch it all on our library's YouTube page, Washington County Free Library, and tune in 2 weeks' time for another outing of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, May the 12th, 7 p.m., right here on YouTube. Have a good night. Bye.